to define his work. So innovative, controversial, deep. But once I saw the title of his paper, I couldn't think about a better word to define him, which is Copernican. So Lou is a Copernican being who has many works in asset pricing, usually questioning models that are, in a sense, very standard. And so Lou has this view that, oh no, that explanation is a kind of partial. Let's include in real investments, production. Lou has also questioned the way standard factors like FAM and French are framed. And so, well, Lou is this kind of person. So he's the founding president of the Macrofinance Society, has more than 12,000 citations. And I could keep going, but I'm not going to compete with Lou. The idea is to hear what he has to tell us about realist asset pricing, a Copernican revolution. Lou, the stage is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you so much for the invitation. I am honored and humbled to be here today. So today I'm going to give you a progress report on a paper I'm writing. I haven't completed yet, but the big picture is pretty well established. Realist asset pricing, a Copernican revolution. So in this paper, I'm asking a transcendental question. What must the financial world be like for asset pricing anomalies to be possible? And my main insight is that firms, not investors, are the primary causal powers of asset prices of their own stocks. And I characterize this insight as a Copernican revolution in finance. Here's a picture of Nicholas Copernicus. He published his On the Revolutions of Heavenly Spheres on his deathbed, actually, 1543, that started the scientific revolution. So prior to him, the dominant model in astronomy is Claudius Ptolemy's Almagest, the greatest compilation published in 150 AD. So it's been a long time. So Ptolemy, following Aristotle, put the Earth as the stationary center of the universe, more precisely our solar system. And the yellow dot is the sun that rotates around us, around human beings. And the red dot is Mars that follows a bit strange of orbit, and there's the retrograde motion, right? Periodically, Mars will move backwards from the normal trajectory and the retrograde motion, and after a while, it will resume rotating in the same direction as other planets. So Ptolemy's way of handling this anomaly is to add epicycle, right? So this smaller circle on top of the major circle. So actually Ptolemy was using more than one epicycle, but by using the epicycle, and Ptolemy get to keep the human-centered, the anthropocentric view of the world. And that this anthropocentrism is actually pretty prevalent in Western philosophy because it's in the roots of empiricism, right? Aristotle said that, hey, we are the human beings, we get to observe and we're not moving. It feels like we're not moving on Earth, right? So we hardly feel the Earth's rotation. So that's the natural anthropocentrism. So Copernicus came along and said, look, let's just put the sun at the center of our universe, and then the epicycle goes away because Earth is the inner planet, right? Inner planet relative to Mars, and Earth is rotating faster than Mars. So when Earth is overtaking Mars, it appears as if Mars is moving backwards. That's Copernicus' explanation of the retrograde motion, and this ontology, fundamental structure of our reality is so natural, and Copernicus said that it's so mentally pleasing that I just have to be right. That's what he was saying. So analogously, I'm going to argue that we have a lot of asset pricing anomalies in our field. And the reason is because our anthropocentric view of the world, we put investors, we put ourselves, we put the human beings, people at the center of the universe to do the pricing, right? Investors are always the ones that we assume are doing the pricing. We have CAPM, consumption CAPM, lots of anomalies. Behavioral finance is still putting people at the center of pricing. Behavioral finance introduces a lot of psychologically realistic descriptions. However, the causal linkages between our psychological biases and anomaly variables are not well established, at least not yet. And finally, we have extensive body of empirical work by Farmer French and others, and the Farmer French factors, SMB-HML, RMWCMA, all these factors are basically epicycles that are added mechanically into our model in order to fit our human-centered CAPM view of the world, or in its extension, the intertemporal CAPM, right? So what I've been trying to argue for the past 20 years is that if you put the firms at the center of our asset pricing universe, all the asset pricing anomalies seem to go away. Right, so in the rest of my presentation, I'm going to describe briefly what exactly is the scientific crisis that asset pricing is in. We found ourselves in asset pricing, and then I'm going to introduce some philosophical tools under the umbrella of critical realism. And then finally, I'm going to do my transcendental deduction that I'm going to try to figure out based on what everybody has been doing. I'm trying to figure out the fundamental structure of our financial reality. Scientific crisis is a phrase from Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962. Right. So Kuhn's idea is that, look, most of the time scientists are working in normal science. We have the CAPM, certainly describes our experience. In asset pricing, we have the CAPM from Sharp-Littner in the mid-1960s. But over the years, we have taken CAPM to the data, right, to testing the data. So over the decades, we have accumulated a mountain of anomalies to such extent we cannot ignore them anymore. And Kuhn goes on and say, at this point, the scientists changed the nature of their work. The proliferation of competing articulations, the willingness to try anything, the expression of explicit discontent, the recourse to philosophy, and to debate over fundamentals. All these are symptoms of transition from normal to extraordinary research. So I guess we are doing crisis science now, right? So my body of work, which I call the investment CAPM literature, is only one of 4 competing articulations, research programs in asset pricing: consumption CAPM, behavioral finance, and the Farmer French empirical body of work. And I burst into laughs when I read Kuhn's writing, The Recourse to Philosophy. It is precisely, I need the meta-theoretical tools to clarify asset pricing debates. Did I enter philosophy of science? All right, so early on, I was asking the question, what must the financial world be like for asset pricing anomalies to be possible? I'm in fact asking a whole list of questions that cover most of the fields, subfields in asset pricing. What must the financial reality be like for the CAPM failure to be possible, for the consumption CAPM failure to be possible, for the success of empirical factor models to be possible? So these factor models are all built on firm characteristics that lie outside the CAPM and consumption CAPM, right? What the world must be like for the investment CAPM results to be possible, for individual irrationality in household finance to be possible. Notice that I've taken investor deviation from rational choice theory at the individual level in household finance. I take individual irrationality as a fact. All right. And what the world must be like for the competitive asset management industry to be possible, and for the macro finance success to be possible. And keep in mind that some of these facts, at least at first glance, right, they seem contradicting each other, right? How can individuals be irrational at the same time asset management industry to be competitive, right? I'm going to try to make sense out of all this, oftentimes seemingly contradictory facts. These are all our experience from studying different aspects of asset pricing. So the nature of my work in this paper is what Immanuel Kant calls transcendental deduction. I'm actually taking a realist position, so scientific realism, meaning the reality is mind independent, not the Kant's idealism. I'm following Roy Baska. So basically, this old Indian parable summarizes what we are doing in asset pricing pretty well, I think. So all these 6 blind human beings, man, woman, right? So these are basically represent hundreds, probably tens of thousands, if not the hundreds of thousands asset pricing researchers all around the world. We're looking at our financial market, trying to figure out exactly what's going on, right? How the world works. So each one of us is starting from our own vantage point. So hypothetically, I would be standing at the end of the line and studying the tail and thinking, because I don't see the full picture, thinking, oh, so the elephant is like a rope. And then I go around telling everybody, so it's a rope, right? So in this paper, I'm gonna take a big picture view. I'm gonna try to do a synthesis, sublation, to quote Hegel. Hegel's sublation means I'm gonna do try to do a creative, imaginative synthesis of everybody's work, and not just a mechanical compromise, all right, and try to get the mind-independent reality. So I am seeking truth in the sense that I'm a scientific realist. Whatever I do feel at any point of time, I do feel that I'm closer to the truth. And of course, all our knowledge is fallible. Human beings are fallible. All our results are fallible, but we keep trying to get to the truth. All right, so here's what I have come up with. So what's the fundamental structure of our elephant, or what's financial ontology, right? As alluded earlier, I'm gonna conclude that firms, not investors, are the primary causal powers of asset prices of their own stocks. And I characterize this statement as my Copernican moment because it stands in contrast to 60 years of asset pricing theory, equilibrium asset pricing theory, dated back to Sharpe, Littner, CAPM. I can go back even earlier to subjective theory of value, but in this paper, I'm going to stay within asset pricing. Moreover, so I'm going to argue the world is not uniform. Our reality is not atomistic, uniform structure as stipulated by Arrow-Debreu economy. For example, our reality is actually much more complicated, stratified and depot. Depot is a word I learned from Nancy Cartwright's 1999 book, The Depot World. Depot means that the world is a patchwork with different patches pieced together in a somewhat disorderly fashion. Okay, you don't get to derive everything from an axiomatic system as in Arrow-Debreu. Right? So why I say household finance and corporate finance are 2 different fields. Very few people in finance would confuse the 2, right? The world is also stratified. Macrofinance and microfinance are 2 different strata in reality. Each of them follows actually their unique, different causal structure. Although they do interact with each other, there's no micro foundation. You cannot collapse micro into micro. On top of that, the consumption CAPM is doing is actually macro reduction, right? Consumption CAPM literature oftentimes says that asset pricing is all about the pricing kernel. It's actually a conflation. You are collapsing micro into macro because pricing kernel is aggregate concept. So I'm going to argue that consumption CAPM is the primary causal structure in macro finance. Behavioral finance is the primary causal structure in household finance. The investment CAPM is the primary causal structure in cross-sectional asset pricing, which is in turn mostly corporate finance, right? So household finance and corporate finance well established to be two different fields, but in asset pricing, we conflate all these different fields all the time. And I argue, so emergentism as opposed to reductionism, emergentism says that as each stratum is different from other strata, although different stratum, different layers of reality can indeed interact with each other, right? So by accepting, by embracing emergentism as opposed to reductionism, so I think I managed to resolve most asset pricing debates in the prior literature, because these debates only arise from our tendency of imposing the causal structure of our own vantage point, of our own stratum onto another, right? So because very rarely we reflect on our ontology. So again, I keep hitting on consumption CAPM, so because the debate has been in the background for more than 15 years. So consumption CAPM keeps saying asset pricing is all about the pricing kernel, but it's only in macro stratum. And the corporate finance and the cross-sectional asset pricing turns out to be a totally different layer of reality. And then finally, in open system, EMH is actually a truism, a largely empty. This represents a deviation from my prior writings. I will no longer defend in EMH going forward, and I will accept it's virtually a truism. Truism means that it's true, but largely empty. And think about how would you forecast the exact trajectory of a feather or falling autumn leaf, right? We know given time it will eventually fall to the ground, but the exact trajectory is exceedingly difficult to forecast. So analogously, I'm arguing that it is exceedingly difficult to forecast future abnormal returns, right? So because we're living in an open system, right? And that's my current understanding of EMH. Right, so let me get to some of the philosophical tools. It's a gigantic literature. I've been going through different areas of philosophy for the past 2 years, and I think I've finally. So briefly, philosophy is very controversial, right? I entered philosophy to seek clarity for asset pricing debates, only to find out philosophers are even more capable of debating, right? So I want to put all my cards on the table, right? This is my web of beliefs as it stands right now. All right, I will keep updating my own beliefs, and at least when my colleagues in the profession disagree with me on some of the specific results, they'll know exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing, right? So critical realism, this is Bascas' Oxford dissertation published in 1975, a realist theory of science. So Roy asked the question, what must the world be like for science to be possible? All right, you see, well, I learned to ask transcendental questions like this. And Basca was in turn building on Kant's 1781 Critique of Pure Reason. And Basca says, what do scientists do most of the time? Well, they run experiments, especially in natural science. In social science, we don't get to run a whole lot of experiments. We do thought experiments. We write down models, right? So now think about experiment. What exactly is the nature of experiment? A famous recent example would be in one of the Apollo missions, an astronaut went to the moon, right? And he dropped the hammer and the falcon feather simultaneously. And he said, we're up here today because of a gentleman long time ago named Galileo Galilei, and we want to test his theory whether different objects with different weights will fall to the ground at the same time. And then he released both objects, and then he says, "Hey, look at that! They both hit the ground at the same time on the moon." Why would he need to go to the moon to do that? Because he needs to close the system, because the system on Earth is vastly open. We have air resistance, right? So we know gravity is always there, you know, impacting, having causal impact on the feather. But on Earth, there's also aerodynamics, right? And a beautiful bird happens to fly by, and the wind changes its direction. So all these different causal mechanisms will counteract, offset the gravity. So that's why we need to close the system. So in other words, what does it mean is that the laws of nature is actually a causal tendencies, right? So the causal tendencies, in particular, the empirical domain and the real domain are different, right? So we need to, the empirical domain is basically what we can observe. The actual domain is actually what happened. In a surprise, it could be the empirical domain is the documented factors already. The actual domain would be all the factors out there, including ones we haven't discovered. And the real domain would be the economic mechanisms underlying the empirical factors, right? So what are the economic causal explanations for the observed factors? So causal powers, right? So I subscribe the causal criterion of reality. So by going to the moon, the astronaut closed the system, so only gravity is the causal mechanism, uninterrupted. Only gravity is at work. But what's amazing is that we already knew that before the experiment. Through our human thought, we figured out gravity will be working at the moon, right? So so we have to go one layer deeper from the empirical domain, all right? So empiricism, logical positivism, right? The official, the dominant philosophy of science in economics, even more so in finance, right? Empiricism, logical empiricism, right? Only acknowledge the existence of the empirical domain and denies the existence of the real domain. Because David Hume says it's metaphysics. Causation is metaphysics. So that's committed to the flames because it contains nothing but the sophistry and the illusion. That's a passage. That's a sentence from David Hume. So we're gonna, you know, I'm gonna follow realists. I'm gonna study causation. So, and emergentism says that the world is stratified, complex, and depot, and any given event has multiple causes. It's jointly determined by an open set of causes. Think about the feather again, all right? Chopping the feather on Earth. So that means that if the world, if the financial market is vastly open, there's no point of writing down general equilibrium model for any purpose, right? I understand we need to write down general equilibrium model for macrofinance because a lot of it, the key question there is oftentimes about the interactions through different sectors of the economy, for example. But even though in those cases, you can never close the system like in an experiment, right? Real experiment. Things are always open. You always leave like political economy, right? The next virus outbreak, these things are always open. So if that's the case, especially in the cross section, that has a lot more heterogeneity going on. So we need to follow the semantic theory of scientific theories as opposed to syntactic theory. Syntactic theory would be the Arrow-Debreu axiomatic system, right? So so we want to write down, we need to, the most productive way to proceed in doing science is to write down small scale models for approximate local closures. This is what Nancy Cartwright calls nomological machines. Okay, so although the world is open, but there are many cases that we can discover through our empirical sciences and different pieces of the elephant, we can at the end of the day put everything together to form our overall structure of our reality, right? Local closure is actually not that unusual. For example, every time you step on an airplane, like with R square 99.99999%, we are going to arrive at our destination safe and sound. That's a local closure because we understand the aerodynamics. So, but the bottom line is that small scale models as opposed to a gigantic model for everything. So we're not gonna have a Laplace's demon that can, so a closed system only works in a Newtonian-like world, right? In the Newtonian mechanics, that Laplace's demon can calculate all the atoms in the infinite future and the infinite past based on the position of all the atoms in the universe today, right? So the world is not determinism in that sense. All right, so this was the piece of philosophy of science I need in order to combat empiricism. Empiricism is my main nemesis at this point in asset pricing debates. All right, because I want to emphasize theory and mechanism. I always have this intuitive sense that we need to do theory, not just empirical work alone. Only, right? Now I know why. It's the philosophy. It's the domain of the real. Now, next, I need the philosophy of social science in order to combat consumption capital, and the behavioral finance. So I'm following Wu Dan's 2001 book. Extremely well written, very informative, right? So what is arguably the most fundamental question in all of social science, including its philosophy, is what is the relation between individuals and society? Right? The individualism, holism debate has been raging on for over a century. Right? The two related debates are closely related at the human agency versus social structure, or micro versus macro, not just economics, micro sociology versus macro sociology. All right. So you can go back even earlier to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, political philosophy, but I'm going to stick with economics, right? So this is John Stuart Mill's 1843, A System of Logic. He talks about psychologism. He's the first one who talks about psychologism, right? He says the laws of the phenomena of society are and can be nothing but the laws of the actions and passions of human beings united together in the social state. So social facts are nothing but actions and passions of individual human beings. So Mill was the first psychologist. Yes, so he takes the psychologistic individualism position, right? So by the time, a few decades later, our marginalist founding fathers arrived at the same Stanley Jevons, Karl Menger, Leon Warras. They went for rational choice theory to build the whole economic theoretical edifice, right? So at the time, psychology was not well developed, so they went for rational choice. Right, axiomatic system again, and Karl Menger actually fought the big methodological debate with the German historical school, because the German historical school scholars want to have a lot of institutions and social structures, and Menger said, "Nah, we're not going to go there. We're just going to analyze atomistic individual behavior, right?" And according to Mill, and that's all we need to study social science. So that's why in economics, rational choice, the individualism is the dominant school of thought. So in sociology, things are more even-handed, right? So the founding father of sociology, August Comte, and Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, and Max Weber, Marx, Durkheim, Weber are the big three in sociology's theories, right? So especially August Comte and Emil Durkheim did a lot of work in establishing, and Marx as well, in establishing sociology is a separate field from psychology. Weber is more individualistic, but he's also pretty good friends with the people at the German historical school. So nowadays, I'm going to again take critical realism position. Again, I'm putting all my cards on the table, and this issue, as noted, has been debating for over a century, right? I'm taking kind of the middle of the road position, a moderate individualistic or moderate holist position, which critical realists call emergentism or dualism. All right, so they are different. This is Roy Baska, Margaret Archer, Tony Lawson, and Dave Aldervest. So their theories differ in different interesting ways, but their basic idea is that human agency and the social structures are both emergent causal powers. right? Corporations, firms have intentions. They have their own objectives, right? So in finance, in corporate finance, this is actually standard, right? Shareholder maximization, shareholder value maximization, or nowadays a little bit the ESG as well. Whereas human beings are also emergent causal powers. We do psychology directly or rational or not. We don't do physiology or cell biology or chemistry or all the way down to fundamental physics, particle physics, right? So I'm going to be taking the emergentism position. All right. So the Kincaid and Zell paper, the very recent publication, Harold Kincaid and Julie Zell are both famous, prominent philosophers of social science. They are not in the critical realist camp, but you see their writing, they're both in the middle. Right, they're moderate individualists or moderate holists, right? So they write down a sequence of increasingly inclusive definitions of individualism. So the first definition would be John Stuart Mill's psychologism, right? Individual, atomistic, Karl Menger, isolated atom-like individual with non-relational properties. I'm not interacting with other people, right? That would be relational, right? And then you can gradually add budget constraint, other individuals like in game theory and price mechanism, right? Social context. I'm actually down here, number 6. I'm emphasizing lower level social entities like firms, right? So according to their definition framework, I'm actually doing individualism. I am actually following individualism. This is why I reserve the word anthropocentrism for consumption CAPM and behavioral finance. Consumption CAPM ontologically follows psychologism. But when it comes to methodology, consumption CAPM works with representative agent. It's actually, I need the number 7 down here, right? Number 7, because there's only one person as a standing making decision for everybody in the economy. That's Hegelian. That's Hegel's world spirit, right? But I understand it's an idealizing shortcut. But you see how unnatural, in a sense, even though we've been working with consumption CAPM for so long, we hardly think about it. But when you scrutinize the philosophical foundations, you get to see how unnatural, how I'm going to say contrived the consumption CAPM really is. All right, let me do my transcendental deduction. So let me do finance meta theory as theory of theories. All right, consumption investment debate. In the era of the blue economy, individualistic, atomistic economy, consumption CAPM and investment CAPM deliver identical expected returns, right? So that's consumption CAPM, that's investment CAPM. In my prior writing, I always say the investment CAPM is as causal as the investment CAPM, with the word causal has a quotation mark. Right, I'm gonna say now with 2 years of philosophy studying behind me, and I understand both are causal, right? So, but moreover, I'm gonna answer the $1 billion question: why does consumption CAPM fail? Actually, before I go there, just briefly, the investment CAPM works. The Q factor model, clearly inspired by Pharma French 3-factor model, but we put the 3-factor model on defense. I guess that means that the investment CAPM theory is working. And the Liu, White, and Zhang 2009 JP paper, we were clearly inspired by Hansen Singleton 82 Econometrica paper. And if you stare at the results, our results are actually much more affirmative, much more positive than Hansen Singleton's test on the consumption CAPM. And in my thesis, I was clearly inspired by Kittel and Prescott, the real business cycle literature, right? So that literature has many more open issues, and we're actively engaging in the specific scientific areas. But now let me take a step back and ask the philosophic transcendental question: what the world must be like for the CAPM, for the consumption CAPM to fail, for the failure of the consumption CAPM to be possible. So I'm going to talk about the two dogmas of the consumption CAPM, anthropocentrism and reductionism. So I mentioned anthropocentrism already, and it's actually pretty prevalent in philosophy and the different areas of sciences because it's so natural. It's in the roots of empiricism, right? So George Berkeley said, "SES percipi," meaning to be is to be perceived, right? For you to exist, we have to see you, we have to sense you, right? So it's empiricism. It's very natural for human beings to put ourselves in the center of everything, especially our knowledge. Let me talk about the reductionism underlying the consumption CAPM. I can go kind of way earlier, but let me start with Lucas, 1976. Very influential Lucas critique. Basically, Lucas was criticizing Lawrence Klein's macroeconometric system, right? And he wants causation in macroeconomics at the end of the day. Lucas's point is that the Lawrence Klein system is unstable because agents can change their behavior. Right? Once government changes its policy, agents are going to change their behavior because there's no causation. It's empirical reduced from fitted models, right? So we need the micro foundation to get to install intentionality as causes. Intentionality is what Aristotle calls final cause, goal-oriented, right? Our reasons are our causes. I work all the time because I enjoy writing papers. I enjoy thinking about science, and that's why I do what I'm doing. That's a cause. So now I understand why I always prefer to work with first principles, because first principles formalizes intentionality, right? So I used to confuse micro foundation with first principles. I was defending micro foundation, but now I realize I was just defending first principles. Because micro foundation doesn't work. It has never worked based on my reading in any of the social science, right, including economics. Lucas wants us to build the macro on the foundation of microeconomics. He calls micro reduction, right? He wants us to write down, at the end of the day, all economics will converge to a unified, ultimate, superior model, a Fortran program, right? That's his wording. But that philosophy of science only works in a Newtonian mechanical world, right? Our social reality just vastly open. So that's not going to happen. So in practice, what do people make do? All right. If micro foundation is infeasible, well, intentionality, yes, but we have never achieved the micro foundation. We always work with representative agent, right? So I'm still digging into some of the philosophy of language, philosophy of mathematics to understand more exactly what's the nature of a mathematical object. But for now, I'm going to take Kevin Hoover's position that that's just a representative agent. It's just idealizing shortcut. It's a shortcut. The mechanisms worked out under that assumption are still real, but they are real by idealizing, by abstracting away from all kinds of other mechanisms, including social dynamics that Schiller was talking about, from social emergence that David Hirschleifer was talking about in his recent presidential address. So, right, so it's emergence is more than aggregation, social dynamics. An individual can change his or her behavior in a crowd. So in practice for consumption CAPM, we're actually doing macro reductionism, right? We assume everybody, we assume the representative agent is doing all the pricing, right? So we're collapsing, we're absorbing microfinance into macrofinance. We're conflating micro with macro because in practice, it's impossible to chase every investor. So we just work with, you know, mathematically or modeling wise, we just work with the marginal investor. So what is the concept of marginal investor? So basically, intuitively, marginal investor is the investor that if we find him or her for a given firm, right, we can find out his or her portfolio choice data, consumption data, and if we fit our consumption CAPM or financial intermediary CAPM or any demand-based CAPM, and then that model should fit if we can identify the marginal investor. The marginal investor could be a combination, right? Not necessarily average, but it could be a fairly dynamic, emergent. A crowd is a social emergence out of individuals. So it's much more complex than our current set of demand-based theories would make it out to be, right? So I've been studying history and philosophy of science for a while, and I come across many demons. So Rene Descartes got the demon, right, for virtual reality. Pierre-Simon Laplace has a demon for hard determinism. And James Clerk Maxwell has a demon that can undo the second law of thermodynamics, and Charles Darwin has a demon that can implement natural selection. All right, and I'm not seeing a single demon for social science. I think it's time for us to have one, and I respect Lucas sufficiently to name a demon after him. So I'm going to name the marginal investor Lucas's demon. All right, I'm hoping to communicate that the idea that a demand-based model with the marginal investor is actually quite implausible. And at the starting point, it didn't hurt to try, but after so many decades, right? After almost 40 years since Lucas's writing, right, and more than 40 years, depending how you count, right? Our science has failed to identify that marginal investor. So in the spirit of a scientific ontology, I'm going to base on our scientific results to draw conclusions about our fundamental structure of reality. I'm going to say, again, is tentatively, I'm going to say that marginal investor probably doesn't exist. And the final point on this slide is it can reconcile my differences with my colleagues in the consumption capital or macro finance in general. Emergentism. Micro and macro are two different strata, each of which follows a different causal structure. Right, I am refuting consumption CAPM or any other demand-based CAPM in the cross-section, in microfinance, in the cross-section of asset pricing, but I am accepting it for macrofinance. So a lot of debates we have been banging our heads against each other. It's all because we have this reductionism philosophy of science in mind. We were following Lucas, right? There's only one model, it better be my model. Right, but there could be more than one models out there because the reality is stratified. Okay, by doing so, I hope to achieve unity of finance by emergentism as opposed to reductionism. Again, reductionism has never worked in social science. The two dogmas in the consumption CAPM also appears in the CAPM. Anthropocentrism, very anthropo means anthropology, means human being centered, right? So that's fairly natural from Markowitz's work because he was looking at portfolio choice, right? But when Sharp-Littler came along and need to aggregate, they need to close the model for analytical tractability, they have to do a similar aggregation as consumption CAPM. They have to do a similar macro reduction. The way they did it is by saying investors have homogeneous expectations or homogeneous beliefs. So if everybody agrees with everybody, right, the trading volume is going to be extremely limited, and everybody is going to hold the same optimal risky portfolio. Right, the trading is really only limited between that optimal risky portfolio and risk-free rate. As unrealistic as it is, I'm going to take a Mackey's realism position in philosophy of science. I'm going to say diversification is fairly important in Markowitz, and therefore under that set of idealizing assumptions, diversification is one part of the causal mechanism, causal mosaic, all right? A combination of different multiple causes in the cross-section of returns. However, it is at work. However, because of all this anomalous evidence that we have seen, right? Diversification or the CAPM is not the primary causal mechanism in the cross-section of return. So Pharma French 1992 rejected the CAPM at empirical level. I am rejecting the CAPM at the theoretical and deeper ontological level. Okay, so on top of that, consumption CAPM and CAPM, because they arrive at their factors through macro reduction. As a result, all factors are aggregate. But that's by assumption. You assume everybody's identical. So only thing left is aggregate variables, right? So again, aggregate factors, aggregate the nature of factors in most of the current literature is by assumption. Okay, it's not the result. In particular, in the investment CAPM, all the factors actually micro, right? Accounting-based firm characteristics. These are micro factors. All right, let me get to get hold of time. Now let me get to behavioral finance, psychologism. So there's been early on the empirical part. Empirical behavioral finance has a lot of Weber style Verstehen hermeneutics, interpretism, right? So not exactly the naturalistic philosophy of social science that I'm taking a stand on, but let me focus on psychologism. So consumption CAPM and behavioral finance actually share a lot of common ground. And this common ground has recently reappeared, which is good, right? So recall John Stuart Mill in 1843 was talking about psychologism, right? So our founding fathers in the marginal revolution worked with think psychologism. In other words, rational choice theory, think psychology, because at the time, 1870s, right? At the time, psychology was underdeveloped. Now it's not the case. It's only natural for behavioral colleagues to introduce more psychologically realistic features into our investor behavior. So Nick Barbaras' very well written chapter in the handbook of behavioral economics talks about extrapolation, overconfidence. That's the non-rational beliefs, and the prospect theory. That's a different preference, a set of assumptions than the standard ones. Right. In particular, Barbaras, Huang, and Sanders, the influential 2001 QJE paper is a pricing kernel, but that's a pricing kernel is based on prospect theory. But the bottom line is that if you take a step back and you say, wait a minute, right? Behavioral models work through covariances too, right? It's also about the pricing kernel, or different non-rational expectations, right? So you work with covariances too. In a sense, the whole efficient market behavioral finance debate oftentimes formulated as the covariance versus characteristics debate is kind of less than meaningful. It's actually meaningless because the investment CAPM works with characteristics. The behavioral models can also work with covariances, but at least we have gained our understanding. All right, so let's just stop debating EMH right now. I'm saying it's a truism, but largely empty. Let's just focus on causal mechanisms. And I see a lot of writings in Barbaras' paper, and that's what he was driving towards as well, which I certainly appreciate. So bottom line is that behavioral finance shares a lot of commonality with consumption CAPM. They both work within psychologism, which is anthropocentric ontology, like the Ptolemy model. All right, so finally, in the remaining time, a few minutes, let me talk about the empiricism, and I've spent more than past 10 years holding up my side of the conversation. So this is college football. I know this is the fake kind of football as opposed to real football in Brazil. Soccer, we call soccer, but it's just the real football. So this is the right traditional rivalry between Ohio State and Michigan. And let me just emphasize that the bowl has an enormous amount of admiration and the respect for the more senior Woody. Okay, and that's certainly how I feel about it, even though I'm taking up the scientific debate. On the personal side, I'm nothing but admiration for my opponents. So with that said, we still need to push the science forward. And in the latest 6-factor model, the authors talk about right, we include the momentum factor reluctantly to satisfy popular demand. We are afraid this is a beginning of a dark age of data mining that produces empirical factors with no hope or little hope of understanding them. With all due respect, I think this is actually the end of the dark age, that their 3-factor model ushered in 1993. Okay, and we, through hard work and all, and the Q-factor model ended the dark age in 2015, right? So in the following sense, why do I say that? Because the 3-factor model achieved dimension reduction, right? Dimension reduction means that you are explaining anomalies based on unification concept of scientific explanation. Scientific explanation is a gigantic field in philosophy. So I'm following unification is a concept you can trace back to William Wellwell, who was writing in the 1840s, and more recently Michael Friedman, who was writing in the early 70s, and Philip Kitcher, prominent philosopher of science on the Columbia faculty. He was writing in the 1980s. The unification means that you unify many different anomalies into a few. Right now, the question remains: what explains the few remaining anomalies? Right, because you are still residing in the empirical domain. So we, on the other hand, we have gone deeper to the real domain, consisting of causal mechanisms. We have causation. The corporate agency is a causation, is a causal structure. Right. So on the other hand, there's a lot of anthropocentrism. So in the French body of empirical work, and here is a famous passage from their extremely influential 1996 Journal Finance article in which they interpret SMB and HML as risk factors in the sense of intertemporal cap-band. Steve Ross's APT is a statistical theory, which I will de-emphasize. I will just emphasize Bob Merton's intertemporal cap-band. Right? Intertemporal cap-band is extension of the traditional cap-band, is still anthropocentric. You are still putting human beings at the center of the pricing. So on top of that, there's no causation between SMB, HML, which are firm characteristics-based factors, right? There's no causation being established between risk factors and ICAP-M state variables that are oftentimes unspecified, right? So you are squeezing epicycles into the Ptolemy model. And we know from Lakatoshian, this is Emery Lakatosh, in his 1978 methodology of scientific research programs, he talks about the Ptolemy epicycles as actually the paradigmatic examples of bad science, right? So he talks about ad hoc degenerating research program. So I'm going to argue based on philosophy of science, Lakatoshian philosophy of science, that the investment cap-band can actually supersede the 3, 4, and 5, 6 factor models. All right, so I'm ready to conclude. In this paper, I'm asking, what must the financial world be like for asset pricing anomalies to be possible? So I end up concluding it's taken a while because I have to get rid of a lot of my own prior beliefs that were restricting, because I was such a student, a good student in grad school, studying masculine wisdom green. I absorbed pretty much everything, right? Including its implicit logical positives philosophy of science. Now I can see a lot of problems because for the past 20 years, I have tried to carry out the Lucas research program. In the Lucas at 1987 sense, I bang into all kinds of problems in the cross-section. And then I finally decided to scrutinize some of the presuppositions that I, along with other of my colleagues, have. So, and I'm going to conclude that firms, not the investors, are the primary causal powers of asset prices of their own stocks. This statement deviating from equilibrium asset pricing in the past 60 years, from ever since Sharp-Littner, and I characterize this statement as a Copernican revolution in finance. And you may think my position is radical. I'm actually not. right? When you think about it. So in the continuous individualism holism debate that's been going on for over a century, right? My position is actually in the middle. I'm doing moderate individualism and I am doing moderate holism. That a lot of the recent philosophical writings are saying it is the right way to go. I only appear radical is because our forefathers, our prior literature is taking a very extreme radical position on the individualistic side, or they are taking the psychologism position. And the pharma French credit due to them, right? They are very serious empiricists, which I have, which I try to inherit, right? But when they come to talk about how the world works, they again put their factors within the extension of the cap band, which is still very radical, individualistic position. I am saying once we put the firms at the center of asset pricing universe, all the anomalies can go away, right? I also come up with a new financial ontology. I argue that in macro finance, consumption cap band is the primary causal structure. Behavioral finance is the primary causal structure of household finance. Investment cap band is the primary causal structure of cross-sectional asset pricing, which is in turn mostly corporate finance. That said, primary doesn't mean only, right? So emergentism means that different stratas and different patches in our depot world are actually interacting. In particular, let me fully acknowledge the recent example of our experience, GameStop, right? And that's a clear case study in which social psychology through social media have an important causal power in the cross-section of asset pricing. Overall, right, in the late 1990s, it's very likely that social psychology played an important role in the episode many people call bubble in macro finance, and critical realism allows us to keep an open mind on all these different causal mechanisms. And I was mistaken before in ruling them out because I was working under the positivism reductive philosophy of science. Now I can see it was my mistake, right? So, and I argue that emergentism can resolve most of the anomalies because our asset pricing anomalies in the current literature been debating, right? A lot of the asset pricing debates they only arise from imposing the causal structure of one stratum onto another, because we are not accepting the different areas can be following different strata, can be following different causal structures. We always have this uniform reductive view of the world. All right, let me end my presentation by citing Immanuel Kant again. So in his 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment? So I'm following him. I'm arguing that we need a new age of reason. We need a new enlightenment in asset pricing, right? A lot of while paying homage to our prior authors, our founding fathers of finance, at this point, I feel a lot of the old ideas have become oppressive, all right? And we need a new age of reason. So sapere aude, which is Kant's Latin for dare to think. Thank you for your attention. Ricardo?
Lou?
Yes, I'm done.
Thank you. We have time for one question. Lou, Lou, are you?
Yeah, I'm here.
Are you there? So thank you for your thoughtful talk. And but could you please provide an example of an empirical work that you can point? Well, that was framed the way it should be.
So can
Be
you
one
ask?
of your papers, for example.
Oh, okay. So the Q factor paper would be a good example. Basically, The Q factor model has investment factor and profitability factor, and we were basing on the net present value rule in corporate finance, and we turned it around as a pricing model. We show that the investment factor and the profitability factor can combine to explain the cross-section of returns. And since 2014, every year since 2014, we've been providing on our data library, we've been providing head-to-head factor spanning tests between our Q factor model and the Pharma French 6-factor model. And we always do pretty well in that regard. In terms of empirically, we show our model shows stronger explanatory power than the 6-factor model. And in our 2019 Review of Finance article, we show that so in terms of economic mechanism and our investment model, which is based on first principle, also seem to make more sense.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. So do I stay on or should I leave now? Should I log out now? What do I do? Tell me what do I do?
You can log out. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Ricardo. Very much appreciate this opportunity. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye. Pessoal, agora